After having focused on the identity of the urban destination, on the urban tourism attraction system, and on the urban tourist, we now focus on the main feedback loop, the impact of tourism and tourists on the destination. We'll do this in a rather unconventional way by focusing on 5 critical observations or misconceptions, if you want, on the issue of urban tourism impacts. Before talking about the critical observations and misconceptions, we briefly deal with 2 main questions. Why do urban destinations develop tourism, and why is the focus on the impact of urban tourism on the locals the most important issue you have to deal with when talking about impacts? There are many reasons why cities want to develop tourism and market their destination. The most important one is an economic one. Governments, industry, and many locals think of tourism as a way to bring in foreign money, thus tourism being the only local export industry. The development and marketing of Flanders as a tourist destination surely has this objective as well. It is the aim of the Flemish government to use tourism as an engine of economic development. A very recent publication of the Tourism Satellite Account for Flanders, which is a way of measuring the share of tourism in the total economy, estimated the gross added value of tourism in Flanders and Brussels on 12.6 billion euro, which is 5.3% of the total gross added value in 2008. By the way, 1 of 12 jobs in the world is tourism related, which makes tourism one of the major industries worldwide. However, next to the increase of the economic capital, Flanders has 2 other main objectives. Firstly, the enhancement of the symbolic capital, and secondly, the increase of social capital. By symbolic capital, we refer to the reputation of Flanders. The development of tourism and marketing of the destination Flanders must, in the end, within 20 or 30 years, have a positive impact on the reputation of Flanders worldwide, and by doing so our country should become more attractive to business and locals. By social capital, we mean that we not only strive for an enhancement of welfare, but also of well-being. Local people must get better, socially, culturally, psychologically, by meeting foreigners, by developing entrepreneurial skills, and by many other aspects that come with the development of tourism. As you might have heard in the objectives of Toerisme Vlaanderen to develop and market the destination Flanders, the final target group of tourism development are, in the end, the locals, residents as well as businesses. It are the locals that have the most to lose or gain from tourism. But there's another reason why you always have to keep the locals in mind in your development process and the outcome of the process. If locals do not support tourism, there might in the end be a hostility towards tourism. And a third and final reason why locals are important is that their knowledge on places of interest for tourism, on the history or culture of the destination, or on any other matter that might be helpful for the planning and management of tourism, is very crucial. The downside of ignoring the view of the residents can be disastrous, as has been shown in many studies. Snaith and Butler summarize several observations of what might happen if, as a planner or as a government, you do not take the perspective of impacts on locals enough into account. There have been cases of a lack of support for the local government, of an unwillingness to work in the tourism industry, which is, by the way, also more and more happening in Flanders. Cases of a lack of enthusiasm in promoting the destination, or even a hostile behavior towards tourists, which decreases the tourist experience, residential protests that slow down tourism development, and so on and so forth. Now it goes without saying that by studying urban tourism impacts, the perspective of the locals and how they think of, talk about, and act towards tourism is of major importance. However, there are many misconceptions, not only by the public or by the media, but even amongst academics, when it comes to the topic of tourism impacts on the locals and the destination. The first misconception is the reasoning that tourism is great for economy, but bad for society in general. Many still think of and talk about tourism as an industry with economic benefits, but with social costs. Typical economic benefits that are mentioned are, for instance, the generation of foreign exchange, employment, economic integration and diversification, reconversion of urban sites, or even revitalization of deprived urban areas, and the economic growth potential. They all have the same underlying reasoning, which is called the multiplier effect. By this, it is meant that tourism generates direct and indirect revenue, and for every dollar or euro that is spent in the destination, a whole chain of economic impacts is put into motion. The multiplier effect is illustrated by this scheme. The direct or primary impact of tourism is that a tourist spends money in, for instance, a hotel. Let's say here in this example, $100. Now $50 of that money goes to goods of suppliers and wages of people working in the hotel, which is here phase B. This supplier spends a portion of this revenue on goods that are bought by a supplier and wages of the people that are working at the supplier. This is phase C. And in phase D, again, money is spent by suppliers on goods and wages, etc., etc. A portion of the wages of the people working in the hotel and with the suppliers is used by them to purchase goods and services. This is phase F, and it is called the induced impacts. The total of money spent by the hotel and the several suppliers in the supply chain are called the indirect impacts of tourism. A last aspect of this multiplier rounds is the money that is lost to the multiplier effect. And there are two ways of losing money to the multiplier effect. Firstly, there is money that leaks out of the local economy because imported goods and services are bought in the supply chain, or some money is saved by the hotel or suppliers. This is phase E in the model. And secondly, there's a portion of the wages paid to the hotel staff and to employees with the suppliers that is saved or is spent on imported goods and services, which is phase G in this model. Now the total multiplier effect is then the sum of the direct, the indirect and the induced impacts, minus the imports and savings. Visually, the multiplier effect is illustrated by this model. The tourist expenditure in hotels, retail or services is again the impulse of the multiplier effect. It is the start. Now these hotels, retail and service businesses, they spend money to households. There are the incomes or the wages of the people working in the hotels, retail or business services. Or they spend money to their suppliers, which are here called the wholesale business. Money from both the households and the wholesale business also goes to the secondary and the primary sector, which is represented by the blue double arrows. Money is lost from the local economy by income leakages, taxes, dividends, etc., which is here in the model represented by the yellow arrows. Next to the economic benefits, there is also widespread belief that tourism raises socio-cultural and ecological or environmental costs. Typical examples are the loss of authenticity or identity, the invasion of privacy, increased commercialism, and increased social inequity, crime, community conflict and tension, crowding and congestion, or pollution. However, reality is far more complex than the idea that tourism leads to economic benefits and socio-cultural and ecological costs. There are, for instance, also economic costs. The leakages that are inherently part of the multiplier model, as we saw before, while leakages are seen as a tourism cost. In urban destinations, leakages are even bigger than in rural destinations, since urban economies are far more open. A good example of the amount leakages can achieve is illustrated by the Ghent festivities. The Ghent festivities are the biggest outdoor festival in Europe, with over 1 million visitors on a 10-day time period. Now, studies have shown that these festivities have a major economic impact, but that the main beneficiary of the festivities is not the local economy of the city of Ghent, but it is the Flemish and the Belgian government. Due to all kinds of taxes, the regional governments earn more money with the festivities than the city of Ghent itself, which however bears most of the costs. Other economic costs next to leakages are the employment problems, inflation, competition with other industries, or dependency of a destination on one industry. If a crisis happens, these destinations often suffer more from tourism losses than other regions. Also, opportunity costs are a type of economic costs, and we will explain it briefly. An opportunity cost is the cost that comes with the investment of money in tourism, which inherently means that this money cannot be invested in any other industry. For instance, many impact studies show that the development of a museum might impact the economy with, let's say, 100 million euro after 10 years. And let's assume this museum costs 50 million euros. This would mean that the museum will have a major impact on the economy. It will double its investment. However, what is not studied is the question whether this investment in the museum is the best investment. It is not unthinkable that the investment of 50 million euros in, for instance, the support of innovation within small and medium enterprises might, after 10 years' time, result in an economic benefit that is much bigger than 100 million, for instance 200 million euros. So then, investing in a museum is actually not the best option. Now, this type of opportunity cost is hardly ever part of a tourism economic impact study, mainly because it is very difficult to calculate it. Spillover costs are both life quality costs, for instance traffic congestion, destruction of natural beauty and so on, and fiscal costs, for instance the maintenance of museums, waste management and so on. Now, on the other hand, there were also a lot of social, cultural and ecological benefits of tourism. There are numerous cases of an increased support for or revitalization of traditions or heritage, of more social, more recreational opportunities, of a better understanding of other cultures, the breakdown of negative stereotypes, the enhancement of intercultural skills, and so on. Page, for instance, gives an overview of 5 types of urban environmental impacts, both positive and negative. Now, as you can derive from this slide, where there are a lot of examples, even in urban destinations where tourism can be less visible than in rural areas or beach resorts, impacts on the environment can be huge. The traditional thinking of economic benefits and socio-cultural costs dates back to the 60s and 70s, when the belief in economic progress was ruling common thinking. During the 70s and 80s, however, socio-cultural and environmental impacts raised on the general agenda and also in tourism, which led to an increased attention for the negative impacts of tourism, firstly on socio-cultural and environmental issues. As a reaction to that, the school who thought tourism is an economic plus, which is called by Jafari the advocacy platform, well, this school also focused its attention on the socio-cultural benefits. And as a counter-reaction, the school who thought of tourism as a socio-cultural and environmental threat, named by Jafari the cautionary platform, well, this school also drew the attention towards the negative economic impacts of tourism. Ever since, this war of positions between tourism advocates and the cautionary school is recognizable in almost every debate, not just amongst the public and politicians, but even amongst scholars. Even nowadays, normative thinking of tourism, which is rooted in this ideological debate, is very, very common. Although Jafari noticed two new platforms or schools of thinking. During the 80s, there was the rise of the adaptancy school, where more attention was paid to how destinations can adapt to tourism, and the knowledge-based school rose during the 90s, which focuses on the increase of knowledge and a better understanding of and insight in the complexity of tourism impacts. Hughes summarizes and undermines the ideological debate by talking about the blessing and the blight ambivalence of tourism. Tourism both has positive and negative impacts, and it is the total context that determines in which direction the impacts will vary and result. When talking about tourism impacts, one must consider several other questions. The first one is the fact that there has been a lot of political use and misuse of the arguments pro and contra tourism. Secondly, when you talk about tourism impacts, you must realize that these impacts are spatially concentrated and they do not take place in the same amount everywhere. Also, the blunt distinction between economic on the one hand and sociocultural and environmental impacts on the other hand is very misleading because economic, sociocultural and environmental impacts, they are highly interrelated. It is also important to realize that there is an enormous diversity of impacts and most of them are hard to measure, which means the perception of impacts is often more important than the actual impacts themselves, which contaminates the discussion on tourism impacts. The diversity of impacts have to do with the different time frame. Impacts can be short, mid or long term. It has to do with the reversibility. Impacts can be reversible or irreversible. It has to do with the tangibility. Some impacts are highly tangible, others are not. With the factuality, some impacts are only perceived, other impacts are real, existing. It has to do with the desirability. Some impacts are desired and others are not. And it has to do with the causality. Some impacts are directly related to tourism, others are only marginally correlated to tourism. Now finally, it is most importantly all about perspective. And this we cannot stress enough. When talking about positive or negative impacts, you must ask yourself, for whom is this positive or negative? Some impacts of tourism might be good for one group but bad for another, and vice versa. And also, there is no such thing as the community. The perspective of impacts of urban tourism is illustrated by this research in Bruges, where local residents were broadly questioned about their opinions on the impact of tourism. 12 dimensions of impacts were distinguished, such as economic advantages for business and for the local population, inflation, cultural impacts, opportunities for cultural recreation, the supply of restaurants and of pubs, the supply of shops, authenticity, the character of the city, nuisance, traffic and crowding, and policy. Now these 12 dimensions, they are represented by the colored bars on the graphs here. These are colored bars. Our study, which we conducted in 2002, 2003, and 2005, showed that there are 4 types of residents. And they all think different of tourism in Bruges and of its impacts. And remarkably, most studies of residents' attitudes towards tourism show the same result as this study. The first group is negative about almost every aspect that has to do with tourism. It's this group, group number 3. Even the economic impacts are assessed as neutral or even negative. We call this group the haters because they hate everything that has to do with tourism. The haters consist of about 16% of the total population in Bruges, and by local population we mean people living within the Golden Triangle, within the rest of the historic city, but also people living within the suburbs. A second group, group number 2, shows the total opposite attitudinal profile. They are positive about everything that has to do with tourism. And on some dimensions they are even extremely positive. And we name them as the passionate supporters. They are about 1/3 of the local population. And finally, there are two groups somewhere in between. There are the cool lovers. Cool lovers here on the right, the cool lovers were positive about almost everything that has to do with tourism, but their positivity is far more moderate than the passionate supporters. And there's also the critical realists. That's group number 1. They have a distinguished attitudinal profile. They are both positive and negative about tourism, depending on the topic you asked their opinion on. And both the cool lovers and the critical realists are about 1/4 of the population. A second misconception next to the complexity of positive and negative impacts is the common belief that the intensity of negative impacts is directly related to the number of tourists, or in other words, many people think that more tourists means more negative impacts. And we will see in this chapter that this is not true. A study of urban destination managers in Europe showed that there is a common belief that there is a limit to the number of tourists in a site. 66% or two-thirds agreed with the idea that there is such a thing as enough is enough. And when you look at the pictures on the bottom, this suggests the same idea. It is widely believed that the left situation is far more desirable than the right one. And also in academics, there are several models directly relating to the number of visitors with the impact of tourism. The left model is so-called irritation index of Doxy, or the Iridex. Its reasoning is that hosts go through 4 stages of irritation when tourism is developed and when the number of tourists increase. Euphoria is the first stage. It's the initial phase when tourists and investors are most welcome. Then apathy sets in when locals don't really care about tourism. Annoyance is a third phase and happens when people are starting getting irritated by the presence of tourism and tourists. And the final phase is antagonism, when this irritation is openly expressed and visitors are seen as a cause of, if not all, at least some major problems within the destination. The model on the right is the famous tourism area life cycle model by Butler. And Butler developed the model in concordance to the life cycle of consumer products and goods. And his idea was that as time progresses, the number of tourists increases and the destination goes through a number of phases. First, there is the exploration of tourism, then people are getting more and more involved, and the tourist destination is developed. After that, a consolidation phase sets in, and at a certain point in time, there is stagnation of the number of tourists. After that, there are 2 options, either a decline in tourism, as was noticed in the famous beach resort of Blackpool in the UK, or a rejuvenation, meaning that tourist numbers are back on track. Now, most importantly, Butler associates a defined set of tourism impacts with each stage of the tourism area life cycle. Thereby, he explicitly links the number of tourists to the impacts of tourism. However, there are several reasons why we should not let us lead by the seducing simplicity of these models, which is described as the billiard ball assumption. The billiard ball assumption is the general idea that tourism hits a region. In this picture, tourism is the yellow ball and the region is the white ball. Now, when tourism hits a region, the region is changed and the new region, a new destination is set in place. This is the red ball. Now, this is a wrong assumption because, first of all, There are many other factors that shape a region, and especially cities. Tourism is just one of them. For instance, there are authors who have described that tourism has changed the values and norms of society, but what they tend to forget is that these societies often opened up to the world and were about to change anyway. Now, in simple words, it is not because at year A there are no tourists and there is no television, and at year B there are tourists and there is a television, then that tourism is responsible for television. However, this type of causality is often drawn. People notice tourists and at the same time they notice new things in a society and they automatically link them, ignoring other factors, complex causality patterns, a hierarchy in factors and interactions between factors. But still, tourism is often to blame, and well, it is believed that this has to do with the fact that tourism is the most visible factor of globalization, and therefore it is the easiest way to link with all type of changes that took place anyway. A second aspect that complexifies the simple academic and common logic is the fact that not only the number of tourists have an effect, but also the type of tourist. For instance, this illustration of cultural differences shows clearly that when the difference between host and guest culture is big, as is on the left of the illustration, then the cultural impact is also big. But when host and guest culture don't differ that much, on the right, then cultural impacts are minimal. And this is especially true for urban tourism, because first of all, urban tourists in Europe come from other European countries, and the cultural differences are therefore not that big. And secondly, many cities are cosmopolitan in nature, and therefore they tend to deal with foreigners quite well. Another great example that shows how tourists differ from each other is how they think of crowding. We have done research about this, and although many people automatically think that crowding is a negative thing, this is simply not true. Some tourists indeed evaluate high space use as negative, but others, on the other hand, evaluate low crowding levels as negative. Or in other words, there are many tourists who like crowded cities. And if this is true for tourists, this is also true for locals. Some locals like crowding and others don't. This brings us to the contextual nature of tourism impacts. The example of crowding is great to illustrate the importance of the context of the destinations or activity for the assessment of tourism impacts. Assume you're sitting on the bus on the left picture. Well, you might indeed perceive crowding as something negative. But assume on the picture on the right that you are at a festival where there's very few other people, then you might just want a crowded place. So crowding is also context related. And this led researchers to come up with illustrations like this one, suggesting that the satisfaction of tourism activities depends on the crowding level and the tourism activity and space itself. Crowded museums or exhibitions or historic houses, for instance, lead to a low visitor satisfaction. That's this point. And also when tourists are hiking in the wilderness, they might prefer empty spaces, meaning not many people doing the same thing as they do. This would lead to low satisfactions when there are a lot of people, which is this point. On the other hand, theaters and concerts, they show the opposite relationship. The more people attending a theater performance or a concert, the higher the satisfaction, as is shown by this line. A fourth aspect that complexifies the academic model, such as Butler's area life cycle and Doxy's iridex, next to the context of the destination activity, the tourist type, and the wrong billiard ball assumption, is the fact that destinations are not powerless to react on tourism. If tourism is managed well, an increase of tourist numbers might not automatically lead to more negative impacts. This picture is taken in Paris, where local residents protest to the development of hotels, and locals' reaction can indeed lead to measures taken by the government that reduce tourism impacts. Limiting the number of tourists is then just one of those potential actions. To sum it up, reality is a field of interactions, which makes it difficult to maintain the models of Butler, Doxey, or many others. Butler himself realized that, and he recently presented this scheme. The blue arrows are the typical arrows that are part of common traditional impact thinking. The numbers, type, origin, seasonality, and other aspects of tourists. They shape the tourist characteristics, which on their turn create ecological, social, and economic impacts. However, recently Butler also added the red arrows, which suggests that the destination can manage the impacts if the right measures are taken, and this can on its turn have an impact on the tourist characteristics. And this is the reason why the notion of carrying capacity, albeit still used as one of the main notions within the sustainability debate, should be replaced by the concept of limits of acceptable change. Carrying capacity means that there is a fixed number of tourists that a destination can carry. In other words, there is a limit to the capacity that can be carried. However, this idea of a fixed number is false. Rather, a destination should decide to what extent change is acceptable and what actions should be undertaken to manage tourism. This idea, where the desired number of tourists is part of a societal debate, it is called limits of acceptable change. A third misconception is that tourists are by many people, in the public as well as amongst academics, are seen as the aggressors and residents are the victims of tourism, while this again is too simple to be true. Let's turn again to the example of Bruges. In our research, we found that the main problem in Bruges is what is shown on this picture. It is people, mostly tourists, walking in the middle of the street. Streets that are still used by cars, bikes, and buses. Now, this phenomenon of people walking in the middle of the street leads to a feeling of invasion by tourists. And when you interview locals, you often hear things like, tourists occupy our streets, they claim the squares, they take over our city, they overrun us, so we have to flee from the city, we are chased away, we have to retreat. Tourists even rape the character of our city. Now, the whole phrasing of tourism is embedded within a vocabulary that is usually only used when people are talking about war. Now, interestingly, this phenomenon of people walking in the middle of the street, they give locals the feeling that locals are irrelevant, that only tourists matter, that tourists are the boss and do whatever they want. This idea of tourist invasion is closely related to the idea of a tourist ghetto. When you ask locals to draw on a map the streets that they like in green, then you have a map like we have here on the right. And when you ask them to draw the streets that they hate in red, then you have a map like this. This is a fantastic spatial segregation. Clearly, the hated zone of the city coincides entirely with the Golden Triangle, while the loved zone is in the north, it is outside the Golden Triangle. And this zone is generally referred to as the original city, the authentic city, the city as it is. And there's a sharp demarcation between the tourism zone, which is hated, and the rest of the city, which is loved. And this demarcation is mental. And when you interview the people, you will find out that this mental map is very, very strong. However, this picture is only true for the haters and to a lesser extent to the critical realists. Because when you ask the passionate supporters of tourism, and to a lesser extent the cool lovers, you get a whole different picture. First of all, these locals don't think of tourists as the invaders or as the boss. On the contrary, they sympathize with tourists. They identify themselves with tourists. For instance, many people talk about how they behave exactly the same as tourists when they are abroad. and the most extreme locals even distantiate themselves from other locals by saying that they are not part of those locals that are complaining about tourism. And they do the same exercise on drawing the places they hate in red and the places they love in green. You got the opposite picture than that with the haters. There are no places hated, and remarkably, the tourism zone is the area that they like the most. The reason why these locals like the Golden Triangle so much is that they consider it as a pleasure zone within the city. Tourists give some locals the feeling of being on holiday in their own town. It creates the opportunity to listen and to learn from other people. And that is an important finding because it clearly shows that the idea of locals as a victim of tourism is only perceived by not even half of the population, while more than the other half think totally different of tourists. Above that, there are many examples of residents that act as so-called agents. In other words, tourists can be victims as well. This slide shows a picture of Jemaa el-Fna in Marrakesh, where you have some local people doing all kind of tricks with monkeys, and by doing so they hope to receive some money from tourists. However, their tactics are very, very aggressive. They walk around, they look for tourists who might be a victim. They approach them aggressively by, for instance, putting a monkey on the tourist's shoulder, as you can see here on the picture. And then other locals, like this one and this one, they come and join the man and they surround the tourist, and by doing so they are putting pressure on the tourist to give money. Now, if you observe these tactics and the impact it has on tourists, you realize that not only locals can be agents of power, but also tourists might have negative experiences because of that. In fact, the locals exploit the feeling of tourists of being in a strange, unknown world. Of course, it can be less aggressive than on Jemaa el-Fna. These pictures illustrate less aggressive but still actual acts of power from locals towards tourists. The two pictures on top are taken in Sicily, where groups of men are hanging around in the street, talking to each other, but also checking out tourists. Some tourists, especially women, might experience a certain threat out of this situation. The picture left at the bottom is taken in Morocco, and it illustrates the same thing. Men hanging around, checking out everything that happens, and by doing so, purposely or mostly impurposely, they create an act of power towards tourists. However, this is not only true for men. The picture on the bottom on the right shows a group of nuns in Malta sitting in front of their cloister and watching everything that walks and drives by. And when we stop to take pictures there, the simple act of stopping their conversation and bluntly gazing at us gave us an unpleasant feeling of doing something wrong, and it made us leave the place as soon as possible. A final example of situations where residents act as agents of power, and definitely not as victims, is this picture in Sevilla, in Spain. A group of tourists walks on the streets, and all of a sudden a motorbike tries to get through by making a lot of noise, and by doing so he scares the tourists. And also in Bruges, bikers ring, they shout, they curse, they even stop and start talking to tourists when these tourists are walking in the middle of the street. Finally, there's also a third way. Many residents have developed coping strategies. They have learned to live with tourists, they have adapted their behavior, and they are quite fine with that. This picture is taken in Bruges again, where the girl here on the bike, well, she does not try to bike through the tourist crowd, she just gets off and starts walking with the bike in her hand. A fourth misconception is the general idea that more involvement in tourism will create a better understanding for tourism and hence a more positive attitude towards tourism. Typical for this line of thought is the common perception that people that are working in the tourism industry or those who have friends or family in tourism, that those people are more positive about tourism than others. And when we look at the residents in Bruges again, it is indeed a fact that the more positive attitude statistically correlates with the economic dependency of tourism. But this relationship is very weak and is also equivocal. There are, for instance, quite an amount of haters working in the tourism industry, which is a rather unexpected result. And moreover, there are also other explanations for residents' attitudes. Gender, period of living in the city, and place of residence explain to a certain extent the attitude towards tourism. And not only from an economic but also from a cultural perspective, more tourist host encounters are by many believed to have a positive impact on the attitudes towards tourism. This school is mostly depending on the so-called acculturation theory, where it is believed that more intercultural contacts lead to a better understanding of and between cultures. But there are also other scholars who believe the total opposite. They think that more intercultural contacts may lead to cultures drifting away from each other. And this is why it's called the cultural drift theory. Next to the two theoretical perspectives on intercultural contacts and understanding, within a tourism framework, it is important to remember that genuine contacts between tourists and locals are very exceptional. Most contacts between tourists and locals are momentaneous and spontaneous. They are limited in space and time, non-repetitive, asymmetrical, shallow, commercial, formal and personal, etc. Many tourists are not even looking for genuine contacts, except for maybe some small talk with locals working in the tourism industry. And indeed, many tourists are traveling in their tourist bubble, within their comfort zone, with only rarely some contacts with the real world they are visiting. Another aspect in the cultural tourist host encounter that one must consider is the fact that also many locals do not want tourists in their world. And there is a concept that is known as staged authenticity. It refers to the idea that many locals act authentic when having contact with tourists, but in fact they are just playing a role. Extreme examples of staged authenticity are enactments or people dressing up in traditional clothing while at home they are wearing jeans. It has regularly been observed that locals deliberately create a front stage of their culture in which interactions with tourists take place and they keep the real world hidden to tourists. This is then considered as the backstage of a destination. Think of a restaurant. Waiters act and talk totally different when they are in the vicinity of visitors than when they are in the back room in the kitchen, where they might analyze the behavior of the customers in wordings that customers would never approve of. When translating the front and backstage into a model, this might be looking something like this. This model is based on Leiper's model of a tourism system. It consists of the tourist destination, the tourist origin region, and the transit route region. Within the destination, however, there are several spaces. The front stage is the region where tourists come. It is the tourist space, and the backstage is where no tourists come, because they are not allowed to, because they don't know where to look for, or for any other reason. A front and backstage can vary in scale. Backstages, for instance, can be neighborhoods within a city, but it can also be the kitchen of a restaurant. This model has an extra aspect. The front stage is divided within a traditional and an extended tourist space. The traditional tourist space is the space that traditionally has been visited by tourists. It consists of the major attractions, monuments, museums, hotels, and so on. While the extended tourist space refers to the trend that tourists are now looking for backstage activities. They want to go behind the scenes because this increases their experience of the city. This consumer trend has an impact on the reach of tourist space that has been extended the latest few years quite considerably. And a final remark when it comes to the strategy of increasing the number of tourist host encounters. This deals with the fact that the will to encounter also depends on non-tourist factors, and it might therefore be an objective that is extremely difficult to achieve, especially within cities. For instance, many people do not wish to work in the tourism industry because they have a lot of other jobs they can choose from, and tourism most of the time is not the best paying one. Also, within cities, locals can choose from a diversity of social interactions, so the need to encounter tourists is often unexisting. Another typical characteristic of cities is that many residents like its social anonymity, and therefore they are not looking for meeting tourists. And even when it comes to involving locals in tourism policy, this is not easy because there are many other policy fields in which one could be involved. A final observation is the conception that tourists can and must be regulated. To a certain extent, measures towards tourists are useful, but there are limits to this approach. In their effort to solve problems with tourism and to minimize negative impacts, a bunch of measures that target the tourist have been developed in cities all over the world. In some Italian cities, for instance, it is forbidden to picnic in the streets. A more soft approach is the one where ethical codes of conduct towards tourists are developed, and also spatial policy and visitor management aim at regulating the tourist, but we will come back to that in next class. Many of these policies target the tourists without genuine insights in the tourist life world, in their minds, in their behavior, in their norms and values. Let's take a look at these two examples. The picture on top shows tourists walking in the middle of the street in Bruges. The picture at the bottom shows tourists walking on a cycle path, despite the very clear signage here on the ground. Now, when you try to genuinely understand tourists, you will soon find out that firstly, the cycle sign on the ground is hardly ever noticed by tourists because tourists do not look to the ground, they look around. And secondly, many tourists might come from countries where there's no such thing as a cycle path. We here in Belgium might be familiar with this idea of cycle paths, but in many countries cycle paths simply do not exist. So how can we expect tourists then to see and notice the cycle path? The same goes with the upper picture. Of course, there's an obvious reason why people are not walking on the footpath, and that is that the footpath is just way too small for the amount of tourists that pass by daily on this tourist hotspot in Bruges. But there's also another less obvious, more hidden reason, and it has to do with the fact that the streets consist of cobblestones. In some mostly Anglo-Saxon cultures, cobblestones are preserved for pedestrian areas only, which make it possible that many tourists think, hey, this is a pedestrian area. But of course it's not, it's a street where cars can drive by and bikes and buses and so on. Now this is a great example of how you must understand your tourist in depth before you take any measures towards him to adjust his behavior. A second aspect that you should never forget is that also the locals have to be taken into account when you develop an impact strategy. Let's take a look again at the city of Bruges. In our research, we asked locals which places they avoided. And these places are exclusively situated within the Golden Triangle, which is on this map, the gray zone. And there are some streets that are avoided for just transportation from A to B, like here or this one. Other streets like this one and this one are not only avoided for transportation but also for shopping, which means that local people do not go shopping in those streets. And also some squares, these squares, are not being visited for transportation or for a visit to a pub or a restaurant, despite the fact that on these squares there's a wide variety of pubs and restaurants. So locals avoid tourist zones, and importantly, many of these zones are at the heart of the city, where there is a lot of symbolic functions, such as City Hall, or museums, or ancient belfries. Now, this avoiding behavior reinforces the feeling of many locals of being cut off from their own city, which on its turn leads to the idea that tourism is in control of the city. However, although locals avoid the most symbolic places in the city of Bruges, it is also an important observation that they do visit them from time to time. An example of locals visiting a tourism zone is this pub, Café Kranenburg. It is situated at the central market square in Bruges, and it is among residents of Bruges commonly known as the only pub at the market square where locals are still the main part of the clientele. Well, in fact, when you observe the customers of the cafe, there are many tourists having a drink there, but it doesn't matter. It is by all Bruges people I've ever spoken to known as the pub for locals, and that is why many locals are still going there, and by doing so, they are reaffirming its image as the local pub. And the second example also has to do with the market square, but now on Wednesdays. On Wednesday there is still a real market going on there, as you can see on this picture. And on this day many locals go to the market square. They don't avoid it. At other days they do avoid the market square because it is swarmed with tourists. Now again, it is the same reason here why locals are using this space, because they can meet other locals. The existence of such type of residential enclaves that have turned into islands of places for meeting locals within the sea of tourists, well, it gives us a clue of what might be an effective tourism impact policy. It is not only about taking the right measures towards tourists, but mostly about giving the tourism zones back to the locals. Locals want to meet other locals in the city, and therefore the creation of meeting places should be central within the city's tourism policy. In short, it is all a matter of place and identity. Locals want to have their own place within the tourism zones, so that they do not have the feeling of having given up certain parts of the town for the sake of tourism. The picture on this slide illustrates this perfectly well. You see several locals playing jeu de boules at the Burg, another central square in Bruges, and they have been doing that for years. And many locals think this is what locals should be able to do within the city, playing their game, doing their thing, meeting the other locals. And it is not only an added value for locals but also for tourists. Look here, two people are watching them, and on a sunny day one can count dozens of tourists observing these locals playing their game. A final aspect when it comes to taking measures to decrease negative tourism impacts has to do with the crucial role of cultural brokers, such as tour guides. The woman on the right here, this woman, is a tour guide. She has a badge, and she's an official tour guide who takes tourists around tourist sites. Now, tour guides, they are mediators between cultures. They mediate information, which means that they give information about places, information that tourists don't have. They also mediate access. They can take tourists to places that are otherwise hidden for them. and they mediate encounters, which means that they could let locals and tourists meet more often and exchange information. Because they are at the fringe zone between two cultures, they could help to foster a better understanding of both the tourist and the local, and by doing so, they could play a crucial role in the management of tourism impacts. To conclude, we summarize the main lessons of the observations on urban tourism impacts. First of all, whenever you talk about positive and negative impacts, you always must bear in mind that there is no such thing as the community. What is positive from one perspective might be negative from another, and vice versa. Secondly, the idea that there is a fixed number of tourists that can be carried by a destination is misleading. These tourist limits are not a given fact, but they are part of the social debate, and they can be managed by the right measures. Thirdly, residents are not always victims of tourists. Many locals do not think tourism is a bad thing, while others have developed coping strategies, and some even exert power over tourists, willingly or unwillingly. So the victimization paradigm, it is sterile and it is simply not true. Fourthly, it is rather naive to believe that involving more locals with tourists, whether it is by working in the tourism industry or just meeting tourists, that this involvement will be crucial to increase residents' attitudes towards tourism. Although sometimes this might be helpful, reality is far more complex, and many locals do not even wish to be involved with tourists, nor do many tourists want to meet the real, genuine local. Although this latter fact has been changing rapidly the latest few years with their quests for locality. And finally, urban tourism impact policy can target tourists, but there is a need for a better understanding of the tourist behavior. Such a policy must also focus on locals, on their feelings of place, of belonging, on a feeling of identity, and finally, such a policy can attribute cultural brokers such as tour guides for playing an important role to gain understanding of and between both hosts and guests. All in all, the debate on urban tourism impacts is not helped with the traditional normative thinking that is common everywhere but has not led to successful solutions yet. On the contrary, what is needed in this complex issue of urban tourism impacts, it is out-of-the-box thinking based on a reality check.